I would like to welcome everybody who's here to the Fires Dune research presentations. And so I'm Professor Deanna Van Dyke, and on behalf of the Department of Geology, Geography, and Environmental Studies, I would like to welcome you to this seminar. And this seminar is focused on presentations from students who have been doing research over the past semester in the first year Research and Earth Sciences course, or the FIRES course. We have 20 first year students in that course this semester, and we have 5 upper level students who are FIRES research mentors for the semester, and so they've been guiding the first year students in their activities. And if you look at the participants list, I've made all of the FIRES research mentors co-hosts, so that would be one way that you could tell who they are. We also have one new Dune on campus this semester, as it has been a very interesting and unusual semester with the adaptations that we've done for COVID. And so we were fortunate to be able to organize building a Dune on campus in late summer. And many of our research projects this semester have focused on that particular Dune. And so what you'll be hearing this afternoon will be some of the first studies and knowledge about this new Dune. But that's not all we've studied. We've also looked at some broader questions. So we've got an interesting array of presentations for you this afternoon. What we'd like to do for these presentations is each time we have a presentation, I'll ask the 4 students who are part of the research team to unmute themselves and put their videos on. And I'll ask them to each introduce themselves. Students, I'll just be asking you to give your name, to give your location, and also to give what you're majoring in or what you might be interested in majoring in, or that you're not sure about your major yet. So that would be the type of information I'll be asking you to give. We have pre-recorded the research presentations. This allowed the research teams to do some crafting of these presentations. So after the introductions, we'll show the video of the presentation. And then after that, we'll have a time period for question and answers. And so at that time period, I'll ask students again, if you can turn your video on at that time period and turn your unmute yourself so that you can answer those questions. I'm not such a Zoom expert that I would know how to show certain videos on your screen at home. And I will just inform everybody, including the FIRES research mentors right now, that as co-hosts, once I start sharing my screen with the videos, I will probably be unable to see a lot of the features in Zoom at that point in time. If it turns out that there's some awkward noise coming from somebody else's speaker or their video, I believe the co-host can go through the participant list and can just kindly mute somebody or turn their video off if that is needed. So this is what the semester has been like. We've all been learning together a lot of these different things, and we've all been doing things for the first time. And so for some of our FIRE students as well, this may be your first time on Zoom. We will get started. And so the first team that will be presenting is the Perseverance Dune team. If the 4 members of that team could unmute yourself and turn your video on. And then I have no idea if on my screen, if I see you in the same order that you see yourselves on the screen. So just as is typical in the semester, just somebody jump in and introduce yourself and then go ahead to the next person after that.
Hey, my name is Jonathan Cooper. I'm from Franklin, Tennessee, and right now I'm thinking about studying in computer science. And yeah.
Hi, I'm Delaney Saul. I am in Grand Rapids currently, and I'm majoring in environmental science.
Hey, my name is Ben Adamson. I am currently in Chicago, Illinois, and I am majoring in environmental science with a minor in recreational leadership.
Hi, I'm Will Weiss. I'm in Detroit, Michigan, presenting, and my major is undecided right now.
All right, so these are the 4 researchers who carried out this next study, and give me just a couple of seconds to get the video shared on the screen, but enjoy their research.
Lake Michigan dunes come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and their behavior and movement is impacted by these factors. While most dunes in Michigan are created naturally, Perseverance Dune was artificially created in August 2020 at Calvin University. Our study sought to determine how similar or different Perseverance Dune is to Lake Michigan dunes.
Our team's study objectives included comparing sand mineralogy of Perseverance Dune and Lake Michigan dunes, also to compare grain size of Perseverance Dune with grain size of Lake Michigan dunes, to measure Perseverance Dune's depth along a line from the top of the dune to the bottom. Lastly, to discover whether and how sand is leaving the Perseverance Dune area. Our study area was Perseverance Dune on the campus of Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The dune is human-made and was created in August 2020. The dune is surrounded by grass and is located on a hill facing north. Here's an aerial view of Calvin University's Perseverance Dune.
You can see in the picture on the right, we started by collecting sand from 14 different places on the dune. In order to find these places, we made a transect line going from the top of the dune to the bottom. We then measured out 7 spots, spaced 5.6 meters apart for the eastern line and 6 meters apart for the western line, and proceeded to collect our samples. We collected the sand using a soil corer. This was to not only collect the sand, but to also see the depth of the dune. We then proceeded to collect sand from the Perseverance Dune parking lot. The way we did this was by dividing the parking lot into 8 evenly spaced sections, all 11 meters in length. We then collected the parking lot sand by sweeping it into separate tins. In order to have a basis for comparison, we also retrieved samples from Tunnel Park, a dune on the western coast of Michigan. These were simply collected with a shovel, as we did not need to know the depth of these dunes. We then brought these samples into the lab and placed them in the oven to dry them out. For each sample, we did grain size analysis using a row-tap sieve shaker, seen on the left here, with sizes 1,000 micrometers, 500 micrometers, 250 micrometers, 210 micrometers, 180 micrometers, 63 micrometers, and finally, less than 63 micrometers. We also analyzed our sand using a microscope. We met with Professor Sturley, a geology professor at Calvin, to learn about what to look for when doing microscopic analysis of sand, and he taught us how to recognize quartz within our samples. Finally, we also wanted to analyze the magnetite levels in our sand. We did this by using a magnet and hovering it over the sand. This allowed us to separate the magnetite from the rest of the sand, again, mostly quartz. We then found the percentage makeup of magnetite to compare to Lake Michigan dunes. When it comes to grain size, it became evident early that Perseverance Dune sand has, on average, a much smaller size than Lake Michigan dunes, as seen in this graph. While the samples from Perseverance Dune seem to linearly go down as the sieve decreases its size, the dune from Tunnel Park saw an immediate reduction in percent pass-through at the 500 micrometers level. This shows that the grain size of that sand was much larger than that of Perseverance Dune. This is important because if our grain size is significantly smaller than typical dunes, it will move differently as it will be lighter and more easily affected by the wind. Additionally, our grain size analysis revealed that the samples found in the parking lot are significantly larger than the sand on the dune, mainly consisting of larger pebbles as opposed to the actual sand. While this doesn't necessarily rule out this sand being from the dune, analyzing the grain size of these samples didn't end up being very useful for figuring that out.
team underwent quite extensive mineralogical analysis of the sand samples collected from Perseverance Dune, as well as from the nearby parking lot and from the Tunnel Park Dune. From our analysis, we discovered that Perseverance Dune had higher quartz content than Lake Michigan dunes. Perseverance Dune was composed of about 98% quartz, while Lake Michigan dunes were only around 80 to 90% quartz. Both dunes had quantities of magnetite, however, they are significantly higher than Lake Michigan dune. As you can see in the image of the sample on the left, the sample from Perseverance Dune, it's mostly comprised of quartz, which is the white, almost glass-like material. The image on the right, one from Tunnel Park Dune, is composed of around 40% magnetite, which is the darker material that you can see. In addition to studying the quartz and magnetite contents of the sand samples, we also attempted to investigate the other materials found in the sand samples. However, due to the scope of that undertaking, we were unable to complete it, and we discovered that it was outside of the scope of the project at hand. Using the sand core, our team was able to determine how deep the sand cover was at various points around the dune. We took the measurements with the sand core as we were collecting the sand samples. You can see that in the picture on the slide above. We discovered that the depth of the Perseverance Dune correlated to its location. It is shallower in the north and south edges of the dune, and the depth peaks just beyond the middle. The depth variations were very similar on both sides of the dune along the lines that we collected the samples on. The graph demonstrates this fact, and you can see how both the blue and the orange lines are quite similar in their correlation. When the construction of the dune was ordered, the depth was supposed to be a consistent 45 centimeters. Instead, what our team discovered was that the depth of the dune varied from 66 centimeters at its highest point to 16.5 centimeters at its lowest point. The dune is shallower around the edges as well, and is generally taller around the middle.
Sand is leaving Perseverance Dune by way of human transport, wind, and water. Image A depicts a footprint left by a student researcher on the sidewalk south of Perseverance Dune. The bottom of image C also shows footprints affecting the movement of sand outside the dune area. Image B is a photo of the homemade sand trap our group placed in Prince parking lot. As can be seen at the edges and especially the bottom of the sand trap, sand was blown from the dune all the way to the trap and stuck to the tape. Image C shows sand leaving the dune area by water transport. Both the top and bottom of image C are photos taken of the same path at the bottom or north end of Perseverance Dune, following a weather event with high winds and precipitation. Evidently, sand was transported to the location along with the water and left behind when the water evaporated. Finally, image D provides another example of how water erosion is moving sand out of the dune area at the north end of Perseverance Dune. The sand trap seen in the photo was placed at the very edge of the sand at the north end of the dune a week prior, and water erosion from the same weather event mentioned earlier caused sand from Perseverance Dune to rapidly expand beyond the boundary. Results from deposition pins placed at the north end of Perseverance Dune also suggest that sand is leaving the dune area by moving north. 4 deposition pins were placed at the bottom of Perseverance Dune. Pin numbers 1 to 4 correspond to their position along the north edge of the dune from the west end to the east, with 1 being the westernmost pin. As can be seen in the chart, deposition was recorded at each of the 4 pins. The pins with more sand deposition, pins 3 and 4, were more towards the east end of the dune, so it is reasonable to assume that sand is being deposited at the northeast corner of Perseverance Dune, as well as at the rest of the northern edge of the dune. The data from the deposition pins provides further evidence that some sand is leaving the dune area by suggesting that as sand heads off the dune area, some is being deposited at the north end of the dune. From our research, we are able to conclude that while there are important similarities between Perseverance Dune and Lake Michigan dunes, there are also key differences between them. Perseverance Dune tends to have finer grains than Lake Michigan dunes and has a higher percentage of quartz sand, although magnetite and other types of sand can still be found on both Perseverance Dune and Lake Michigan sand dunes. The depth of Perseverance Dune varies and is not 45 centimeters deep across the entire dune as originally planned, with shallower sand at the edges and deeper sand towards the south of the dune. Sand is also leaving Perseverance Dune through human transport, wind, and water, and some is being deposited at the north end of the dune. Sand will probably continue to leave the dune area, especially during weather events with high winds and precipitation.
Okay, thank you very much to that research team for that presentation. And even though I was here for the semester, I felt like I learned some new things from your presentation. We'd love to have audience questions at this time. And we also realized that usually at this time there would be wild applause. So the team should just assume that wild applause is happening in all of the rooms behind the names that you're seeing on your screen right now. Will be a challenge to everybody to figure out how they can unvideo themselves quickly and applaud on screen. And everybody's handling that quite well, actually. So if you have a question, you have a couple of ways to ask your question. There is the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on that and relay those questions. But you could also just unmute yourself right now and ask your question.
Yes, I have a question for you all. I'm wondering if you had a chance to do this study again, what would you change about what you did?
That's a good question. I think one thing that I would have changed is we started out with a very broad scope and a lot of things that we wanted to do, which led to us running out of time to do some more extensive mineralogy analysis, and also just kind of really having to work hard to figure out what we wanted to include in our final results.
I think another thing we maybe could have done is, and I don't know how we could have done this, but collecting the sand from the parking lot in a way that didn't collect as many pebbles, because those ended up throwing off our grain size analysis of the parking lot sand significantly. So it didn't end up being like super effective for us seeing whether or not that sand was actually from the dune. So I don't know how we could have done that better, but maybe if we took an extra bit of time to figure something out there.
I would say I probably would have. I would have thought it would be a good idea if we had come up with a little bit more of a, like what Delaney said, a little bit more of a solid plan of how exactly to find our results, because we spent quite a bit of time working through a lot of analysis that we didn't really end up using, and it didn't end up being that useful to our final conclusions. So if we had some more time to plan out and lay out how exactly we were gonna do all of the experiment, and if we had just had a better idea of how things were gonna work out, we could have potentially laid it out in a more effective way.
I agree with Delaney and Jonathan. We should have thought about time more as a factor, because that kind of cut us down to where we couldn't done as much as possible.
Thank you. And I'm seeing a bunch of questions coming in the chat. One of those questions, I feel you've addressed it in part already. It's a question about what setbacks did you experience that you weren't expecting? So I'll move on to the next question, which is, somebody saying that they're curious if you know where the sand from Perseverance Dune is from, who supplied it, and where did they get it?
I don't remember the actual name of the company, but I do know that it was Michigan based. So it is in that way kind of comparable to like Michigan Dunes because it was from Michigan.
And possibly I'm the better person to answer that question because I was on site when the sand came here. You're exactly right. It was Michigan based and it comes from a pit in the Grand Rapids area. So it's not from the lakeshore, but its original origin would have been glacial as the sand from the lakeshore. I think it's very interesting the differences that your team was seeing with that. We, in the interest of keeping moving with the next team, we're going to move on, but I'll say that at the end of all of the presentations, that there will be time for people to ask additional questions, or we might go back in the chat and cover some questions that we haven't been able to answer. So everybody give this team a round of applause again. And the second team will be the Dune surface changes team. So that team can also work on unmuting and putting their video on right now. And for the Dune surface changes team, if you want to start introducing yourselves.
Hello, everyone. I am Michael McGilvery. I am currently a undecided major, and I am presenting from Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Derek McClure. I am in Kalamazoo, Michigan right now, and I am currently a business undecided major.
I'm Haley Postma. I am from Jenison, Michigan, just outside of Grand Rapids, and I'm a psychology major.
Hi, I'm Emma Tuitt. I'm currently majoring in marketing, and I am presenting from Middleburg, Virginia right now.
All right, thank you all, and we'll move on to showing your presentation. Again, there will be just a few seconds as I get this loaded up.
Our group spent the 6 weeks focusing on how dune surface changes on the Perseverance Dune.
Michigan dunes are influenced by wind and precipitation. Higher wind velocities affect surface movement. Studies listed on the slide provide references for wind characteristics and sand transportation, giving us information to help shape our study and create focus on how wind and moisture affect Perseverance Dune. Multiple methods were used to obtain data and assess the developing dune and its relationships with weather and sand movement.
The research question that our group focused on was, how does wind and precipitation affect sand movement and surface change? We understand that both of these factors affect how the sand moves, but we want to know how they affected the sand together. Study area. Perseverance Dune is an artificial dune that is located in Grand Rapids, Michigan on Calvin University's campus. The surrounding area is important to notice because the dune is artificial. Above the dune, if you look at the map, is a parking lot. To the right of the dune is a building, and beneath the dune is a pond. Also, the dune is placed on grass that is at a downward slope towards the pond. These are all important factors in noticing when looking at the dune. Study objectives. Our group had 4 study objectives. These objectives were to assess the current condition of the developing dune, to measure wind and weather patterns for the same 2 weeks, to measure sand movement and surface changes for 2 weeks, and to analyze the results for relationship between wind/weather and sand movement.
There were 5 methods used to complete our research project. We documented current conditions on the dune
with taking photos and collecting sand samples for moisture content analysis. We also use sand traps to measure sand movement and erosion pins to measure surface changes. We use wind vanes and anemometers to see how the weather affected the dune during our study.
Here you see a map of Perseverance Dune. Fence posts are numbered and border the perimeter of the dune. Additional erosion pins were placed on the dune slope and several outside the north perimeter. Anemometers are scattered across the dune surface, and there are 2 sand traps located in the center. This map, created in ArcGIS, is very helpful in identifying where equipment was used throughout the course of the study. A symbol key is provided for reference.
Results of moisture content. We spent 3 weeks studying the moisture content in the sand. If you look to the picture above on the map, you can see 7 green dots, which locates where each of the samples were taken. Over the 3 weeks, these samples were taken in the same spot, and the data is recorded below. From the graph, you can tell that over the 3 weeks, on average, the moisture in the sand decreased. And the area that had the most moist sand was pin E, located at the bottom of the dune, which is at the bottom of the hill.
The graph shows that in the first 2 weeks, the sand traps did not collect any sand. However, in the third week, the southern trap picked up 580.34 grams of sand, and the moisture content was 5.04%. Also, in the third week, the northern trap picked up 134.93 grams of sand, and the moisture content was 3.45%.
This graph represents a framed portion of all measurement data of the erosion pins taken from the study period. The graph portrays changes in measurements north to south on the west side of Perseverance Dune. Week 1 showed most erosion, and deposition is mostly shown in week 2.
Wind data was recorded by the highest elevated anemometer on a wind tower. The graph represents both the average and maximum wind speeds, and the predominant wind direction is listed above each day. An obvious pattern shown by the graph is that wind speed increases with storm activity. The first week saw storms on days 4 and 5. Week 2 had 1 windy day, and week 3 had frequent storms. On day 19, the winds reached 12.5 meters per second.
Discussion of the moisture content. There is a gradual decline in moisture content of the sand over the 3 weeks. This is because there was a storm that passed by in the first week, and the following 2 weeks did not have as much precipitation. The pin that had the most moisture content consistently was pin E. Pin E was located on the northeast part of the dune, which is where most of the water accumulates. We have concluded that this is because pin E is located at the bottom of the dune. Because Perseverance Dune is an artificial dune, the water does not seep through the ground, rather it hits the grass underneath and flows towards the bottom of the hill.
There was a lot of rain in the first 2 weeks, so there was not any sand in the traps. However, when the third week came around, the sand dried out, and this is what caused results to change so drastically in the third week.
Week 1 showed the most erosion due to lots of storm activity and high winds. Pins 26, 28, 29, and 30, located on the north side of the dune, or the bottom corner, show the most erosion. These pins show the most erosion because this is where the water runoff is.
Wind data showed that winds from the southwest direction were most frequent. These winds came from the surrounding parking lot and flowed down the dune. Strong winds resulted in significant sand caught in the southern sand trap during week 3.
In conclusion, we found that the sand samples showed more moisture content near the bottom of the dune, erosion pins showed more erosion near the bottom of the dune, sand traps showed the sand movement during the storm, and wind speed and direction showed more movement during the storms. With this new knowledge, our data can be used in years to come to observe how Perseverance Dune may or may not be progressing.
We would like to thank Calvin University for offering the class and providing space for the dune. Also, thank you to Peter Dimstrom for guiding us and giving a great insight throughout our research, and Dr. Deanna Van Dyke for providing us with great input throughout our study. Lastly, we would like to thank Michigan Space Grant for their funding for our research, which allowed us to study on our dune.
All right, thank you very much. And wild applause again. And we already have a question showing up in the chat. And if other people have questions and just want to unmute themselves, that will be okay also after this question. The question is, why do you think week 3 had much more sand in the sand traps than the first 2 weeks?
That is a great question that we asked ourselves at first. And so the first factor was the sand traps at first were placed a little bit higher above than they were supposed to be placed. They should have been more flush with the sand, and that could have affected it. But most importantly, because of all the rain that was coming in the prior weeks, it was causing the sand to just be dense and wet and sit towards the ground, kind of as like a hard clay, and the wind wasn't being able to pick it up and move it. Whereas over the weeks, as we were getting less rain and the sand was getting drier, then it was able to blow more and gust with the wind and get trapped into the sand trap. So I guess the answer would just be the sand was more dry.
I have a kind of a follow-up question. You mentioned wind having an effect in drying out the sand, and also in erosion pins, you talked about the northwest corner being impacted by rain and the movement of sand there. So I guess I was wondering if you saw any evidence of wind patterns in your erosion pin data rather than just in sand traps.
I am not sure. I was looking at the sand traps the most, and I would say the bottom part of the dune that was accumulating, that was very wet. I think that is more a factor of the slope than the wind. So the rain was more dragging the sand down there than the wind blowing the sand.
Yeah, so for our wind data towards the end of our study, so the last week, week 3, the winds were a lot stronger. So the erosion pins on that northwest corner were affected with a combination of the precipitation effect. With the storms came a large amount of rain, which had moistened the sand. So that had limited the sediment transportation rate. And then the wind down at that far corner did help the sand move a little bit, but because it was already moistened, it had limited.
Thanks. We have two questions that might almost be related. We have a question that says, were any of the results surprising to you all in terms of weather and the effects of weather? And maybe I'll just start with that question and we'll go with the second question in a minute.
Yeah, I think the further amount of data we collected really made evident like the effects of storms and precipitation on Perseverance dunes. So it just gave us more insight. I don't really think that anything necessarily surprised us out of the ordinary, but it was very interesting to keep on learning the effects of the weather on Perseverance dune.
And that's going to be a good advertisement for our next presentation, which will be on autumn storms. But there is still a couple of other questions here. Do you think your results would have differed if this experiment was conducted during the start of the summer?
I do believe that it would completely depend on the precipitation and the weather. So in the summer, the sand would dry up faster, I would say, but we could not really tell. So that would actually be very interesting to continue research on the dune and see how from the fall to the winter to spring and summer, how it would differ. But I would say the heat would be the largest factor in drying up the sand in the summer.
And then I'm not sure if you have these numbers right at your fingertips, but another question says, what was the maximum wind speed recorded for Perseverance dune?
I believe the maximum wind speed was around 12.5 meters per second, and that was recorded on the 19th day of our study.
Okay. Thank you very much. And the timing is perfect here as we need to move on to our next presentation, but another round of applause for this research team. Great work. And while everybody's applauding, the next team that is up is the Autumn Storms team.
Hi, I'm Lily Cooper. I'm currently presenting from Lowell, Michigan, and I'm undecided to what I want to major in, but I'm interested in Spanish and international development.
I am Nathaniel Kastner. I am presenting from Greeley, Colorado, and I am currently planning to major in geography.
I'm Sadie Norman. I'm from Fulton, Illinois, and I'm majoring in environmental studies.
My name is Henry Schenkel. I am from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I am majoring in digital film and media.
Excellent. And this team is going to continue our look at what's happening on the dune with talking about autumn storms. So again, give a few seconds for the video to queue up.
Hello and welcome to our presentation on the autumn storms on the Perseverance Dune.
To introduce this research study, significant storm erosion patterns have been recorded on the Lake Michigan sand dunes, especially during the autumn season. Perseverance Dune is a young artificially built dune on which the effects of storms had not yet been analyzed, thus the motivation for researching this topic. The research study was centered around the impacts of autumn storms on Perseverance Dune and was conducted by 4 undergraduate Calvin students. Our study investigates how the characteristics of autumn storms influence erosion and surface characteristics on Perseverance Dune. Our objectives were to assess storm characteristics, compare patterns of dune change with storm characteristics, to analyze patterns of erosion on the dune surface, and to investigate dune characteristics before and after a storm.
This study was focused on Perseverance Dune. It is an artificial dune located on Calvin University's campus in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Some major landmarks to note are a building to the west, a pond to the north, a parking lot to the south, and trees to the east. Another major thing to note is that the dune slopes downwards from the parking lot to the pond.
Some methods that we used were anemometers located around the dune, as well as on the wind tower to collect wind data. This wind tower is pictured to the right and is located on the south side of the dune. There are 4 anemometers on this wind tower and a wind vane at the top. We had 3 other anemometers set up in the other corners of the dune. We also monitored rain gauges. There were 2 gauges, one on the south side of the dune and one on the north. Another set of methods we used was the use of collected temperature readings with an infrared thermometer and a temperature probe we placed near the wind tower. We also took sand samples before and after a storm and dehydrated those samples in an oven to determine the moisture content of the sand. Lastly, we set up an erosion pin grid with 30 erosion pins at the bottom of the dune, which is pictured below. The picture shows a GPS map of our erosion pin grid. All of the green dots are our pins. Each pin was placed 2 meters between each other. As well as showing the erosion pin grid, the GPS map also shows where we placed our rain gauges, which are shown as blue dots, the anemometers, which were shown as purple dots, and our temperature probe is shown as a red dot. We took data measurements on October 22nd, October 29th, and October 25th, which were our 3 lab days for the data collection period. And after the 2 storms that we had, which were on October 22nd through the 23rd, and October 31st through November 1st.
Each storm produced increased wind speeds and precipitation. The wind data from both storms is summarized in this table. The first storm occurred between October 22 and 23. This storm produced about 2 centimeters of rain and some wind. The rain was steady and continued for about a full day. The second storm occurred between October 31 and November 1. The primary component of this storm was strong wind from the north and northwest. In fact, the highest daily average wind speed of our study was recorded on November 1, which was at the height of the second storm. The second storm produced only about 0.6 centimeters of precipitation, some of which was snow. This graph shows the erosion changes across our study area after the second storm. The erosion pins were laid out in a grid pattern as represented in this graph. Each letter represents a colored row of erosion pins, beginning at the north end of our study area and ending at the south end. The amount of erosion is indicated in the column on the left side of the graph. Bars of the graph that point upward from the 0 line represent deposition. Bars of the graph that point downward from the 0 line represent erosion. As you can see, a significant amount of erosion occurred at the south end of our study area. Our data shows that some locations experienced more than 5 centimeters of erosion. The greatest cause of erosion during the first storm was likely rain, since wind cannot dislodge wet sand. Our wind direction data also shows that the wind was blowing from the east and south during this storm. Because Perseverance Dune slopes to the north, these winds were not blowing directly at the sand. During the second storm, the greatest cause of erosion was likely wind because this storm produced less precipitation to hold the sand together. We hypothesized that the northwest winds, which were typically the strongest, likely increased as they moved up the dune slope, eroding a greater amount of sand in the process. This hypothesis fits the erosion data, which shows a higher amount of erosion on the south end of our study area. While rain was likely not the greatest cause of erosion, the evidence of water erosion is apparent in these photos. Before our study period, the sprinkler system carved out part of the west side of the dune and transported sand to form a washout at the north end of the dune. Rain that occurred during our study period and at other times continued to erode sand and deposit it on the washout. This caused the width of the washout to increase significantly. The left photo was taken on October 22nd, which was the beginning of our study period. This image is looking southwest, so the washout was formed by the water flow coming from the west side of our study area, which is on the far side of the dune in this photo. The second photo was taken about 4 to 5 days after our study period, which shows the expansion of the washout to the edge of a pathway. These images indicate that rainwater erosion was quite significant. In summary, we found that erosion of sand was primarily caused by rain during the first storm and wind during the second storm. Rainwater erosion was present, but based on precipitation and erosion data, we believe that rain runoff caused less erosion than wind. The most significant wind erosion occurred during the second storm. During that storm, the unobstructed northwest winds hit the dune with full strength, eroding more sand the further they traveled up the dune. All this data suggests that rain and wind caused significant erosion on the Perseverance Dune.
To conclude, the 2 significant storms on Perseverance Dune caused notable erosion and surface change on the researched dune area. The storm winds and rainfall caused significant stand movement and erosion patterns. We would like to thank the Department of Geology, Geography, and Environmental Studies at Calvin University for providing the research opportunity. We acknowledge the Michigan Space Grant Consortium and Calvin University for providing the funds for this opportunity. Additionally, we would like to thank Deanna Van Dyke for her guidance as she oversaw our project, and our mentor Claire Skotanis for leading our group's research and for setting a great example of how to conduct a scientific research study. Finally, we would like to thank the students who helped assemble and worked with the wind tower and the data collection involved in that. And here are some of the sources that we used to help our research. And we would like to thank you all for listening to our presentation. If there are any questions now, please do not hesitate to ask.
Great. Look at all that clapping that's going on in the audience right now for that presentation. I want to give just a minute or two to appreciate all of that applause. And we already have a question in the chat for the team, which says, having seen the impact autumn storms can have on the dune, how do you think the dune would change as it gets older and receives more storm events?
I think the water erosion at the bottom of the dune would continue expanding significantly, potentially covering a small paved path that was at the bottom of the dune. I also think that more sand may be transported by wind over the top of the dune. So there may be some reduction of the overall quantity of sand on the dune in the future.
Yeah, Melinda, go ahead.
Thanks. I can't find my hand raising thing right now. Okay, wow, that was really fascinating. I was wondering, is there a sense that if the dominant wind or if the storm wind tends to come from the north and the dune itself is sloped, with downhill going to the north, did you consider at all the possibility of the two movements of downhill erosion from water and windborne erosion sort of acting to cancel each other out at any point in your study? Is that a reasonable consideration that I've raised? Did it come up at all? I'm wondering if talk to me about that.
So yeah, that's a really good question. So there was a significant amount of erosion on the on the south end of our study area, which was at the middle of the dune. So that seems to say that the erosion was occurring significantly. And in addition, not all of the water erosion was on our study area. A significant amount of the water erosion was on the west and side of the dune. So we believe that wind erosion is most significant and is likely causing more erosion than water erosion.
We have a question in the chat that says, when you started this research, were you expecting there to be so much erosion at the south part of the dune?
Honestly, no. I was totally expecting there to be the greatest amount of erosion to be on the north end of the dune, since that was lowest. In addition, a few of our erosion pins fell over during the study period, and all of those pins were on the north end of the dune. So I was thinking there would be the most erosion on the north end of the dune. However, the erosion data showed that the greatest erosion was on the south end of our study area.
And another question that's in the chat is, you mentioned the average wind speeds during the storms. Do you have an idea of the wind speed on the non-storm days for comparison?
Yes, we do have the wind data charts available to us, and based on that data, we can see that the wind during the storms was significantly higher than during normal days.
And I'll just give an opportunity here if there's anybody who wants to ask a question through the video. And then I'll remind you of a couple of things. We'll have some opportunity at the very end for people to ask questions of any of the researchers. I'll also mention that we have a feedback form, which we are hosting on the web because our funding agency, the Michigan Space Grant Consortium, wants some information about who's attending our presentations and what they think of the presentations. And so one of the mentors has been putting that link into the chat. So I'd encourage you maybe at the end to use that feedback form. You can do that either for an individual presentation, or you can give us feedback on the whole presentations as a whole. There's a place there where you can check off which presentations you actually viewed. We're gonna move on now to our next presentation. And with our last two presentations, we're moving a bit more into thinking about management of dunes. The next presentation is going to be an interesting one on an experiment that was done on Perseverance Dune. And if I could have the four presenters show up on the screen and introduce themselves. Excellent.
All right, hello, I'm Lauren Grantham. I am majoring in environmental studies, and I am currently presenting from White Lake, Michigan.
I am Isaac. I'm majoring in accounting, and I am presenting from Novi, Michigan.
Hi, my name is Jack. I am an HR major, and I'm currently presenting from Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Hi, my name is Linda Steen. I'm presenting from Chicago, Illinois, and I'm majoring in chemistry and environmental science.
All right, and so this group of presenters is going to take us into the world of experimentation. Again, just a few seconds while I do the technical work of getting the presentation loaded up.
So our group decided to specifically study Calamavilfa's longifolia's effect on sand movement and other characteristics. And my group included Lauren, Isaac, me, and Linda. Calamavilfa longifolia is a sandreed grass and is a common plant that you see whenever you go to the dunes. This plant tends to thrive in sandy environments, and it is such a critical plant to the dune because it is one of the grasses that stabilizes sand dunes and sand blowouts. However, dune-dwelling plant species are severely prone to damage from pedestrian and human impacts. So our research question is, how does the recently planted Calamavilfa longifolia affect the dune environment? So for our study objectives, our group formulated three objectives. Our first objective was to investigate levels of erosion or sand deposition around recently planted Calamavilfa, along with the moisture content of the sand. Our second study objective was to investigate the effects of trampling and density on the plants and amounts of nearby erosion or deposition. Our third and final study objective was to compare the characteristics of dune surfaces for the different experimental groups.
The study took place on Calvin University's Perseverance Dune in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The three plots of Calamavilfa longifolia that we studied were plot A, plot B, and plot D. And the one control plot that we studied was bare, and that was plot C. Plot B was trampled 3 times a week. The map uses different plots to specify the location of the plots of Calamavilfa, individual plants, and erosion pins. We used a variety of different methods to collect results on the effects of human trampling on dune plants. The plants were placed 30 centimeters apart in a 5x7 formation. Plot D was a condensed plot, and plot B was the trampled plot. In order to gather information about erosion and deposition and also moisture content, we placed sand traps and erosion pins around the research area and collected data and measurements twice weekly. In order to gather information about the effects of trampling, such as plant height and grain size, we placed plants in a 5x7 formation, 30 centimeters apart, and trampled plot B each lab period and then 2 other times during the week. And then to gather information about comparing dune surface characteristics such as sand temperature and erosion, we compared data to other plots using sand traps, erosion pins, plant height, moisture content, and ground temperature.
Looking now to the results, regarding density, we found that the least deposition occurred in the bare sand plot. Some erosion actually occurred in the bare sand plot during the first time period. During our second time period, the height of the erosion pin recorded did not change, meaning that there was neither erosion nor deposition. Plots A and B were density. They had similar amounts of sand deposition occur, especially during the first time period. Plot D was of the highest density and had a significant amount of more sand deposition occur during both time periods. During the first time period, the average sand deposition in plot D was approximately 10 centimeters. In comparison, the sand deposition during the first time period for plot A was about 7 centimeters. Even though the second time period overall did not show as much sand deposition, there are still significant differences. The average sand deposition for plot D during the second time period was approximately 2 centimeters, while for plot B it was close to 0 centimeters. As described in the previous slides, plots A and B had very similar results regarding the amount of sand deposited at each plot. Initially, we believed that this meant that the trampling of Calamavilfa longifolia had no impact at all on sand deposition. However, upon closer visual observation, we noticed some slight differences in the shape of the sand deposited. The top picture shows a singular plant from plot A, the untrampled plot. Looking closely, you can see that the sand was deposited to the left of the plant. It has deposited to have a similar appearance to a hill. Either side of the deposited sand is sloped, with the peak of the hill lining up with the plant itself. The height of the hill gradually decreases as it gets farther away from the plant. The bottom picture comes from plot B, the trampled plot. Upon observing the trampled plot of Calamavilfa longifolia, we noticed that the sand was not deposited in the same shape. There are no visible sand deposition formations on this plot. Although we mostly observed the effects of density and trampling on erosion, we also observed other characteristics such as ground temperature and moisture content. When analyzing the ground temperatures of the plots, we saw no significant differences. However, we did notice differences in the moisture content between the trampled and the non-trampled plot. During our first time period, the moisture content was higher in the non-trampled plot for both the sample taken at the top of the plot and the bottom. For example, the moisture content at the bottom of the non-trampled dune during the first time period was approximately 5%, while for the trampled plot, the moisture content was about 4.7%. The samples during the second time period overall had lower moisture contents, but the samples from the non-trampled plots still had a higher moisture content than those taken from the trampled plot.
So what do these results mean? These results meant that planting Calmavilfa longifolia increased sand deposition because the plant slowed down wind speeds, allowing for more deposition compared to the plot with no vegetation. And the plot with the highest density of Calmavilfa showed the highest point of deposition because the plot that had the most Calmavilfa compacted in one area, allowing it to be able to stop the most wind. And connecting it to the article Influence of Reed Stem Density on Forward Dune Development, the plot with the highest density of reed stems also showed the highest point of deposition. So for at least both reed stem and Calmavilfa longifolia, the higher the density, the higher point of deposition was present. Lastly, the data results indicated that the moisture content for plot A was higher than plot B. So it was evident that the healthier these plants were, the more it retained water in the soil. As plot A was the plot with Calmavilfa, which were untouched, compared to plot B, where it contained trampled Calmavilfa. For our study, we have concluded that the increased density of newly planted Calmavilfa longifolia caused an increase in sand deposition, and the trampling of the plants impacted the shape of the sand deposition, but did not appear to have a significant impact on the amount of sand deposited. Finally, the trampling of the plants caused a decrease in the moisture content in the surrounding sand. We would like to thank Calvin University and the Michigan Space Grant for funding our research. We thank Professor Van Dyke for providing us with the necessary resources and knowledge to effectively perform this study. We also appreciate our mentor, Grace Prom, who assisted us in developing and executing nearly every part of this lab. And this below is the works cited. This concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just look at that applause. Excellent, very interesting stuff. We have definitely time for questions, and I was going to mention one from the chat, but I think that's from the last presentation. So I'd encourage, Claire has a question.
Yeah, you guys mentioned that there was erosion happening right towards the beginning of your study, and I wondered if you guys had any theories or if you saw any reasons why that might have been.
I would say the reason for the erosion would probably be because of, we've also had several days where there was a high gust of winds, also with the weather patterns that we had throughout the course of our experiment. Those could have been underlying factors of why we had erosion.
It was definitely windier in the first labs compared to the labs in the very end.
Thank you.
Okay. We have a couple of questions showing up in the chat now. So first of all, did you consider the moisture content being affected by the transpiration differences between healthy, basically between healthy plants and unhealthy trampled plants? So that process of plants giving off water and transpiration, do you think that was a factor?
I definitely think that the condition and the health of the plants affected the moisture content. And I think we really saw that, especially in the graph that was presented, that typically the, which was it? One of the plots, it consistently had a higher moisture content, meaning that the plants probably took up less of the moisture.
Okay, and then we've got a question that says, why did you choose to study Calamavilfa longifolia specifically?
So I would say that it's mostly because Calamavilfa specifically is a very popular and common plant in dunes, especially in Michigan. So it's very prevalent in Michigan, and that's probably why we did it.
Then there's a question in plot D where you had higher plant density. Would that high density eventually make it difficult for plot D plants to survive?
I think that might be something really interesting to study, especially with maybe the ability of the sand to support all the different root systems. Unfortunately, we didn't really get to see any differences because we were so focused on the health of the plants between those that were trampled and untrampled.
And you had the shorter time period as well. It might be interesting to see that happening over a longer time period. There's another question. Did the presence of other dune vegetation make this study more difficult?
I would say probably not, just because we took all of the Calamavilfa longifolia and planted them into its own separate plots. So that's probably why the other plants didn't really affect our data as much.
And then I'm going to finish off with one last question here, which is what recommendations based on your study would you have for dune managers?
I would say for sure that we need to do a better job of protecting our dunes. As you can see, for an example, over in Silver Lake Dunes, we're experiencing a lot of erosion, and it's just we need to develop better mitigation strategies to save these dunes because they're a beautiful natural resource.
I'm just checking whether anybody from the team wants to add anything to that. All right. Well, another round of applause for this team. Thank you very much for your work and for answering the questions. And while the applauding is going on, our last research team can get themselves ready, as we're going to continue this look at dune management, but take it in a different direction. So currently I see Noah available, but hopefully there are a few more people. Oh, excellent. Yep. Go ahead and introduce yourselves, team.
Hello, I'm Noah Millen. I'm from Holland, Michigan. I'm here in Holland too, and currently I'm studying environmental science.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm from Grand Rapids, and I'm an accounting major.
I am Aubrey Rudy. I'm presenting from Noblesville, Indiana, and I'm an environmental studies major.
I'm Ethan Tolp. I'm from Ames, Iowa, and I'm an environmental science major.
All right, excellent. Give me a few seconds and let's hear what this team has to say about dune management strategies.
Dune management is defined as restoring eroded areas and stabilizing others using a variety of strategies such as vegetation, sand fencing, sand netting, and boardwalks. Unfortunately, there is no official inventory of dune management strategies for the state of Michigan. Although there is no official inventory, dune managers are still able to contact each other and find ways to manage the dunes effectively. Our group created a survey to ask dune managers from the state of Michigan what strategies are currently in use and how effective these strategies are. Our study objectives were to create a survey about dune management strategies, survey dune managers from Michigan, receive and compile data from survey responses, and analyze the survey responses.
The study area of our project includes state and national parks around the upper and lower peninsulas. However, some private parks were included. Areas with dunes along the Lake Michigan coastline are highlighted in black along the lakeshore to the picture to the right. The objectives for our project were to create a survey about dune management strategies and to survey dune managers from Michigan, and then to receive, compile, and analyze the data from those surveys. In order to do that, we constructed survey questions about common dune management strategies, and then created questions asking about the experience of dune managers surveys. We then contacted Michigan dune managers to get emails from the survey via cold calls and distributed the survey via email to Michigan dune managers. We then gathered survey responses in Microsoft Excel and drew conclusions from the data given and created visuals for our poster presentation.
As a result of one of our first objectives, we had a survey that we sent out to our surveyees, and there was a number of questions asking about certain management strategies. These included boardwalks, sand fencing, protective fencing, vegetation manipulation, whether that included vegetation planting or vegetation removal, and sand netting. So each question included something like the visual that you're seeing above. They were asked to rate the effectiveness of each strategy if it was implemented in their dune ecosystem. And this was able so that we could kind of see how different people were expecting their strategies to work, especially for the different areas that were surveyed. And then for kind of our other half of our survey was just managing to assess the managers themselves. So there were personal evaluation questions, and we have here an example of a self-assessing manager question. This one is an example of evaluating performance as a dune manager, and this one we asked them if they rate themselves 1 to 10. Other questions involved education that ranged from a high school, college, or advanced college degree. That was like a multiple choice question. We asked them for their comfort level, rating themselves from 1 to 10, expectations for having the responsibilities that they have, and their own effectiveness from 1 to 10.
And now the results of our survey. This first slide is the results about management strategies. The first graph there on the left is the graph of usage of certain dune management strategies. As you can see, vegetation and boardwalks were the most commonly used strategies, both with 5 surveyed uses. Sand fencing and protective fencing were next with 4, both of them, and sand netting only had 1. The graph on the right is the graph of average effectiveness of those management strategies rated by the dune managers surveyed. And the sand fencing actually was rated as the most effective, although it was not the most commonly used. But all of them, sand fencing, vegetation, boardwalks, and protective fencing, were all in a range of 3.5 to 4 out of 5 effectiveness. One thing to note is that sand netting was not included on our average effectiveness graph, as there was only 1 surveyed use, and the average would have been disproportionate. This slide is results pertaining to the managers themselves. As you can see on that first graph on the left, 5 out of the 6 managers surveyed did not expect to be managing dunes when they started their current position. And as you can see from the graph on the right, there was a range of education levels the managers surveyed, ranging from 1 with a high school diploma, 3 with bachelor's or associate's degrees, and 2 with an advanced degree. The managers also rated their own effectiveness as a dune manager on a 10-point scale. Those scores range from a 3 to a 7 out of 10. In analyzing our data, we noticed that managers use vegetation in different ways and for different purposes. We use the term vegetation manipulation to describe any management strategy involving vegetation. And some of those different ways were planting native species or removing invasive species for the purposes of preventing erosion or protecting decks or patios. And another thing to note is that many of the parks surveyed have not planted vegetation within the last year, but they have at some point in the past.
Because Michigan has never had an inventory of dune management strategies, making the results of the survey were particularly important, and some of the more interesting findings things that we found to discuss was the popularity of infrastructure. And that, what we mean by that is that the most popular and maybe observably the easiest dune management strategy would be that of building something or implementing something that is measurable in a quick way with a very observable quick results. So boardwalks, sand fencing, sand netting, those are all things that you can build and very clearly see what they are doing and how they are helping, and most of the times a fairly fast timeline. Another thing to be discussed is the limited specialized education for dune managers in their fields of work. There was an almost very clear from our survey results that not a lot of people had specialized education within their education, or they didn't receive education for their particular job. Lastly is the reluctance to overmanage, as stated by the survey managers, supporting the fact that exacerbating the process of sand movement and dune erosion can be bad for the ecosystem and the economy as a whole. Our conclusions showed the most used management strategies included boardwalks, vegetation manipulation, and protective fencing. Dune managers rated sand fencing and vegetation manipulation as the most effective dune management strategies, and dune management was an overall unexpected job. This included people saying that it was not something that they went into education for, or if they did go into education for it, the job was different than what they were expecting.
We would like to thank the survey participants, Professor Deanna Van Dyke, our mentor Jillian Herlinger, the Department of Geography, Geology, and Environmental Studies, the Michigan Space Grant Consortium, and Kelvin University.
Thank you very much. Everybody's getting so good at this wild applause here. So we have time for questions now. And if somebody's got a question, they can just go ahead and speak up right now. We've got nothing in the chat at the moment. I may adopt a question from earlier and ask your team, what was the most surprising result that you had? And then I see Ralph Sterling will have a question after this one.
I'd say one of the most surprising results, at least to me, was the fact that almost the majority of dune managers either didn't know that they were going to go into dune management, or that they thought that it would be a much easier and quicker job than what they actually thought. That was super interesting to me. I'd always thought that people who were doing dune management had always thought that that was what they was going to do.
Just checking whether other team members have anything to add. Ethan, were you about to say something?
I can just add that it surprised me a little bit how low, we asked them to rate their own effectiveness, and it was surprising to me. I expected them to rate themselves a lot higher, but there were a lot of 3s and 4s and 5s out of 10.
Dr. Sterling, you've got a question.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I know, well, one of the variables in these management processes is human compliance, right? So was there a way you could kind of assess either indirectly or directly from the answers, whether the managers experienced a lot of sort of public non-compliance? In other words, if you put up a boardwalk and everybody refuses to walk on it, or if you put up sand fences and everybody, it violates them in some situations, but not in others, how does that affect the management strategies and their own evaluations of their management strategies? I know some of Professor Van Dyke's study groups out on the lake have had to confront these sort of crazy variables in the past. And so I was curious about that.
Yes, that is very much true. So on our surveys that we asked, we also kind of provided just an opportunity for the dune managers to maybe explain just if they had anything to say per each specific dune management strategy that we kind of asked them to rate. And I believe that on some of them, I mean, that's kind of where it comes down to, especially with boardwalks, just whether or not these dune managers kind of saw compliance, and that kind of factored into how they rated the effectiveness of it. If it not only did its job to protect the dune, but to also kind of keep people out. So I think that was kind of factored into the results that they gave us.
Yeah.
So we've got a question in the chat that says, what were your biggest challenges in your research?
I would say one of the biggest challenges that we faced was trying to get contact information for all of the dune managers. There's not a website to do that, so it was a lot of doing research on that as well.
And then we've also got a question that says, I'm curious about the sand netting. What does it look like and how effective would you say that it is? So can you explain the sand netting?
Essentially, it's just a net to stop sand. What was interesting about that, as far as the survey goes, is we only had one response that actually used sand netting, like one manager. But they rated it like they said it was very effective for them, but they were the only ones that actually used it.
And maybe for people who don't know, when you say it stops sand moving, can you describe, is this like a volleyball net that you put up in the air, or how is that used?
You maybe could use a volleyball net if you really wanted to.
Yeah, you could.
It can come in many forms. And so the porosity, or like how much holiness it kind of has in it, is pretty much up to the dune manager. And I think maybe that's why, even if it's not used a ton, it works really well for some people, because there's a lot of factors that you can choose, like how tall it is, what material it is, if it's plastic or if it's something more like cloth or something, and exactly how many holes are in it or how big those are. And so I think maybe that's why maybe not a lot of people use it. Maybe seems a little intimidating. It's kind of a maybe lesser known dune management strategy. So yeah, but it worked well for him, the one who used it.
Mhm.
And so to add a little bit of clarification also to the audience, often sand netting is basically put parallel to the ground, on the ground, to hold the sand in place, often used with planted vegetation. So I'm not sure if that came out in some of the answers that you had, or possibly as I think about your presentation, if people haven't planted vegetation recently, maybe there's some sort of relationship there with them also not using sand netting recently. We have room for other questions right now, if there are any questions from the audience.
Have we answered the question about the biggest challenges yet?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
If you have some additional biggest challenges, go ahead.
Just getting people to respond to the survey was a great challenge for us. And the survey is still going out to people, and we can still get responses from it. But initially, just getting survey responses to do our work was pretty challenging, just like all surveys were.
And so I may end with the question that I asked the last group. If you had some recommendations for dune managers based on the results of your research, what would your recommendations to dune managers be?
I would say just based on our results and the effectiveness of people rating it, that using sand fencing and then the use of vegetation seem to be really effective for a lot of dune managers. So if you're not using sand fencing or any type of vegetation, maybe taking a look at that just based on those results would be worthwhile.
And I think also just paying attention to the kind of dune that you are dealing with. In all the survey responses, it was pretty unanimous that everyone was saying that you kind of just have to see your situation, and that obviously a sand fence is going to work better in some locations than it is in others. So just taking the time as a dune manager to understand what's going to best accomplish what you need to do there, I think is totally worthwhile, and it'll be a lot more successful.
Well, let's say thank you to this team. One more round of applause for this team. This is your last chance, everybody, for a round of applause. So we're going to morph then into a round of applause for all of the teams at this point in time. And I'd like to think that this is applause both for the presentations that you just did now, but also for the many hours of work that went into doing the research and designing the study, carrying out the measurements, and then analyzing the data and being able to tell us about it. I will let the whole audience know that there is another opportunity. If you were very intrigued by some of the stuff that you heard and saw in these presentations, these projects are also represented in the virtual SEEP poster session. So that's a Kelvin Environmental Assessment Program poster session. It happens at the end of every semester. This group are pioneers because the poster session has been reduced in size by other classes not producing posters, but we are well represented in this session. And possibly one of our mentors may be able to put a link into the chat, or I'll do this after we, oh, there, the link has just appeared. The mentors are really wonderful and on top of it. So if you click on that link that's in the chat, you can view the posters, you can leave comments for the researchers, and they'll be checking for those comments and they'll be replying to them as well. But if you were intrigued by some of the data, the posters might be a place where you can look a little bit more closely at some of the graphs or get in contact with the researchers to ask them questions. I'm going to officially call this seminar, these Dune research presentations, to a close. But if we're in person, typically there's a little bit of conversation that goes on afterwards with people meeting in the aisles or asking questions. So anybody who does have more questions or wants to chat with any of the presenters can stay. And otherwise, thank you all for coming and for enjoying and appreciating and supporting this Dune research.